It's Halloween again, that time of the year when you put on a costume and go to a party, stay at home and play scary video games. This month also happens to be the 20th anniversary of the PlayStation 2 in North America, so I thought it'd be a good idea to look at what it has to offer in terms of horror. Turns out it has a lot to offer. The PS2 is home to some of what are considered the best horror games of all time, like Resident Evil or Silent Hill 2 and 3, but it also has some more obscure games, like obscure. Joking aside, the PS2's horror library was incredible, and made several innovations to the genre that are commonplace in more modern games. The big question though is, why the PS2? What was it about the PlayStation 2 that led to so many great horror experiences? So, the PlayStation 2 obviously didn't invent the survival horror genre. Games featuring spooky monsters and harsh, dark environments have been around for many years. One of the earliest games that's considered a survival horror is Sweet Home for the NES. It came out in 1989 and features all the item management and heart-pounding monster encounters that you would expect from something like Resident Evil. And it's low-key one of the best RPGs on the NES. However, the reason that it doesn't come up that often is that it was only released in Japan. That brings me to one of the reasons why survival horror took so long to take off in the West: audience. Before the 90s, psychological horror wasn't all that mainstream in Western cinema. Of course, there were the exceptions, but most horror was more violent and action-y. However, these more cerebral movies changed the way a lot of people thought about horror, opening the gates to a wider range, the most relevant to this video being J-horror. The late 90s saw Japanese horror really make it big in America for the first time with Ringu and Ju-on, both of which would be later adapted into English. This new wave of J-horror fans soon extended to the video game world, leading to all of the Japanese-developed horror games on the PS2. The other factor that was limiting the horror genre was the hardware. There was a reasonable number of horror games on the PlayStation 1, but most of them were held back by the limitations of the console. Konami, as they still had creativity in 1999, were able to use the PS1 draw distance to their advantage with their genius fog system, but most games weren't so lucky. The resolution and sound quality of the PS1 just wasn't enough to provide the immersion. Don't get me wrong, there are several points in Resident Evil 1 that scared me, but there's just something about looking at this face that takes me right out of this creepy zombie mansion. Then in 2000, the PlayStation 2 busts in with its faster processor, a DVD player, and incredibly realistic graphics. This new console allowed developers to try out new things and better ways to scare players. This increased flexibility for horror is just another part of why there are so many more memorable, scary games on the PS2 than the consoles before it. Alright, now that I've discussed at least some of the reasons why there are so many unique horror games on the PS2, let's actually get into some of the mechanics and other elements that make these games so special. Before I get into the new stuff that the PS2 tried out, it's important to look at some of the older mechanics that were brought across the generations. The two big ones here are the use of tank controls and fixed camera angles. Tank controls are certainly a relic of the past, back from before the twin stick layout most games use today. However, a lot of the time the frustration of moving like a semi-truck actually adds to the tension as you fight with the stick while a group of zombies slowly makes its way towards you. Hand in hand with tank controls is a fixed or semi-fixed camera. Not being able to control what you see on screen give games an almost cinematic feel, as every turn of a corner becomes a mystery. I think one reason why many people dislike these features is when one is used without the other. In my research for this video, there were several times playing Rule of Rose and Fatal Frame where the camera would transition to another angle, and my character would turn right back around or run into a wall or something. These mechanics are certainly divisive, but they really gotta be used together for the full effect. One area that PlayStation 2 horror games really excelled in was the fresh, alternative forms of combat. Resident Evil and Silent Hill on the PS2 continued the gun-focused combat of their PS1 entries, but many other games tried super unique combat systems or moved away from combat entirely. The obvious example of this is Fatal Frame. Taking the idea that cameras can steal a person's soul, all of the combat in the series is done by taking pictures of ghosts with your camera obscura. It's a super unique mechanic, and almost gives the game a first-person shooter kind of feel. Several other games use stealth as a main mechanic, like Siren and Haunting Ground. The feeling of just crouching in a corner and hoping the chasers don't find you can often be way scarier than fighting them head-on. The complaint I have about these stealth-focused games, though, is that it can get repetitive really fast. In Haunting Ground specifically, it felt like I was spending more time hiding under beds than solving puzzles. Speaking of puzzles, there's a lot of them. Puzzle solving has always been a big part of the survival horror genre, I guess because nothing's scarier than logic and deductive reasoning. But really, some of these puzzles, especially the ones in the Silent Hill and Fatal Frame series, are pretty good. Also, as I touched on earlier, knowing that you could be attacked at any time as you're pushing blocks around is really stressful. Another innovation of this console generation was the inclusion of sanity effects. The concept of the player being messed with while playing was really pioneered in Eternal Darkness, but that wasn't on the PS2, so I'm not talking about it. Anyway, sanity effects were used in a few PlayStation 2 games, namely Haunting Ground, where the more damage you take, the more these disorienting afterimages pulse, and at low sanity your character can even run out of hiding on her own. This isn't really a mechanic, but while I was playing through these games, I realized that one weird through line that several of them have is dogs. Haunting Ground and Rule of Rose both have a dog as an important part of the story, and of course, there's Resident Evil 4.
Hey, it's that dog.
I guess Silent Hill 3 also has dogs, but I don't really want to pet those ones. Horror games are still really popular today, probably even more so than they were in the early 2000s thanks to the rise of Let's Plays, and they've changed quite a bit, but the influence from the PS2 era can still very much be seen. Tank controls and fixed camera angles are all but dead, as they aren't necessary with modern controller layouts, but you'll see them occasionally return, especially in indie games. The real influence, though, is in the psychological aspect. Games like the Amnesia series really took the sanity and stealth mechanics of older games and cranked them up to create some of the scariest games ever made. Psychological interaction has extended past horror games too. Don't Starve and Darkest Dungeon, while they probably wouldn't be considered horror by most, use sanity mechanics that really add to the tension. The more old-school horror genre does seem to be making a comeback though, with the super good remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3, and the upcoming game The Medium for PS5 looks pretty promising. It even has music by Akira Yamaoka of Silent Hill fame, which is really cool. Also, maybe those Silent Hill rumors will be true. I don't care if it's Silent Hills or a reboot or whatever, I will take it. So this Halloween season, or really any time you're in the mood for something spooky, maybe go check out what the PlayStation 2 has to offer. My personal recommendations would have to be Silent Hill 2 and 3, or any of the Fatal Frame games, but really most of the PS2's horror library has aged pretty well. They may not be as graphically deep as newer games, but sometimes that classic feel is what you need. Alright, happy Halloween.